Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really diving into a single, incredibly dense day, November 10th, 2025. It honestly felt like a whole year packed into 24 hours.
It really did. The sources you pulled together are quite something. I've got over 15 different pieces here.
Yeah, a real mix. U.S. politics, global markets exploding, tech breakthroughs, international conflicts flaring up, serious climate events. It's all in there.
And that's our mission today, isn't it? To take this snapshot, this single day, and really synthesize it for you. We're looking at how a major domestic crisis, like that huge U.S. government shutdown ending, immediately sends ripples across the globe.
Exactly. Well, at the same time, these big, long-term things, climate change, quantum tech, they just keep marching forward, almost regardless of the daily political drama.
So the goal is to connect those dots. How does a shutdown in Washington link to a record high on the London Stock Exchange? How does a diplomatic shift in Syria connect to climate migration?
And there's this recurring theme we notice, this thread running through almost everything. We're calling it the Great Deferral. It seems like the main strategy for tackling huge problems, budgets, borders, climate, wasn't really resolution.
No, it was more like a strategic punt, right? Kicking the can down the road.
Precisely. So we want to untangle these ruptures, these rallies, these reversals for you, the listener. The aim is that you walk away understanding the real-world impact when the focus is just managing the immediate crisis instead of fixing the underlying problem.
Okay, so where should we start? Probably Washington, D.C. That's where the political noise was absolutely deafening.
Yeah, let's start there, the end of that historically long government shutdown.
Right, so by November 2025, this shutdown wasn't just an inconvenience. It felt like a national embarrassment, really. A symbol of gridlock.
It had gone on for so long. It wasn't just about failing to pass a budget. It really felt like a fundamental breakdown in the ability to govern. Federal operations were basically in triage mode.
And the sources really detailed the depth of that disagreement. It wasn't simple, just about the overall spending levels.
No, it was much more tangled than that.
Exactly. It was this intense multi-front battle. Yes, over the baseline funding caps, but also loaded with these really charged policy riders. Things like demanding more money for border security, specific tweaks to the Affordable Care Act, even trying to block rules about climate reporting.
Just a perfect storm of incompatible demands from both sides.
Pretty much. And the human cost was becoming unbearable. You had tens of thousands of federal workers forced to work without pay, and many in absolutely critical roles.
Yeah, we're talking air traffic controllers, TSA agents checking bags at airports, border patrol, even weather forecasters. Essential jobs.
They had to show up, do their jobs, but with this constant gnawing uncertainty about when or even if they'd get paid. Imagine that stress.
The financial strain, the psychological toll, it was clearly reaching a breaking point.
Absolutely. And the risk wasn't theoretical anymore. There was real concern about mass resignations, especially in those high-stress jobs like air traffic control. They were already short-staffed before the shutdown.
And it wasn't just the workers. Businesses, financial markets, they were getting really nervous too, weren't they?
Increasingly vocal.
Yeah.
The shutdown meant a blackout of crucial economic data. No reliable unemployment numbers, no GDP updates. It made forecasting almost impossible. Confidence was just draining away.
Okay, so then November 10th arrives, the breakthrough, it comes from the Senate. Why then? And how did they actually pull it off?
Well, it's a very pragmatic move, you could say, though highly criticized from certain quarters. Senate leaders managed to push a funding package past a crucial procedural vote.
And how did the Vites line up for that?
It got most of the Republican caucus, but the key was peeling off a small group of moderate Democrats. They basically decided that reopening the government now was more important than holding out for bigger policy wins later.
Ah, okay. And this is where that core theme we mentioned, the Great Deferral, really comes into play, isn't it? They didn't actually solve the big underlying fights.
Not at all. The deal simply funded the government into January 2026. That's it.
Just a few months down the line.
Exactly. The ultimate political punt. They postponed the big battles over border security, healthcare, climate policy, just push them off for a few weeks, basically guaranteeing another showdown right after the new year.
So you have this immediate, almost palpable sense of relief, right? Federal workers were told they'd get back pay. Economic data would start flowing again. Markets, as we'll get into, they rallied hard.
Huge relief. But on the other side, the political backlash was instant and pretty fierce.
Especially from the progressive wing.
Oh, yeah. They hammered the deal. The argument was that their party leadership had basically caved, given up crucial negotiating leverage just to get a temporary fix. a fix that didn't address any of the policy demands they'd been fighting for.
A feeling that avoiding the political heat was prioritized over winning actual policy battles.
That was the critique, yes. And beyond the immediate politics, there's this lasting damage mentioned in the sources.
The morale issue.
Exactly. Federal employee unions were putting out statements warning that even with back pay guaranteed, the breach of trust, the trauma of working under that kind of pressure for weeks without knowing if you could pay your mortgage,
Yeah.
that's going to hurt recruitment and retention for years.
So the political failure has these really long-term ripples far beyond just the next budget deadline.
And you didn't need to wait years to see the immediate fallout. The air travel system was probably the most visible casualty of the whole shutdown mess.
Right. The FAA had been sounding the alarm louder and louder. They were saying explicitly that the staffing shortages among air traffic controllers directly because of the shutdown weren't just an inconvenience anymore.
They called it a systemic safety risk.
A safety risk, and that led to direct action.
It did. An emergency order mandating capacity restrictions. This wasn't a suggestion. It was the FAA imposing mandatory phased flight cuts across 40 major airports.
40 high-impact airports. What did those cuts look like?
The sources laid it out clearly. It started with 4% cuts on November 7th, then ramped up to 6% on November 11th, 8% on the 13th, and finally hitting a huge 10% reduction by November 14th.
Wow, a 10% cut across major hubs right before the holiday travel season kicks in? That's massive disruption.
It was chaos already by November 10th.
Yeah.
One report said over 2,000 flights were canceled the day before, and something like 10,000 were delayed.
Oof.
Yeah. Airlines like American, United, they had to publicly confirm they were complying, issuing thousands of travel waivers, scrambling to adjust schedules.
And here's a really crucial point from the sources. Just because the Senate passed that funding deal, it didn't mean the chaos just stopped.
Absolutely not. Transportation officials made that very clear. Those mandatory flight restrictions, they were staying in place until the FAA's safety metrics actually showed improvement.
Because you can't just magically fix the underlying problem overnight.
Exactly. You can't instantly train new controllers. You can't immediately undo the damage to morale that probably led to higher sick leave rates or people deciding to retire early during that whole unpaid period.
So the economic fallout from that travel mess, lost business trips, canceled vacations, delayed cargo that was locked in, it was going to drag on through Thanksgiving, maybe even into December, no matter what happened in the Senate.
The structural damage just takes way longer to heal than it takes politicians to cut a temporary deal.
Okay, so we've got the legislative branch finally breaking the logjam, but causing immediate operational pain. Let's shift to the judicial and executive branches, because November 10th was also a huge day for actions that really test the limit of power and accountability.
It really was. Starting right at the top with the presidency. President Trump issued a series of very sweeping pardons.
And these weren't for minor offenses, were they? Who was getting pardoned?
These pardons went to individuals involved in the efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. We're talking former campaign staff, White House advisors, some state-level officials.
And the charges they faced.
They range from things like conspiracy to defraud the government, obstruction of an official proceeding, issues around submitting false slates of electors. These were charges aimed right at the heart of the democratic process.
The reaction was, predictably, split right down the middle.
Immediately, allies praised the move, calling it justified, saying it corrected politically motivated prosecutions, a legitimate use of presidential power, in their view.
But the criticism was intense, more than just disagreement, right?
Oh, yes. Critics denounced it forcefully, calling it a dangerous precedent. The argument was that it essentially undermined judicial accountability, potentially signaling that future officials could act improperly regarding elections or transitions of power and expect a pardon later. It sparked a huge debate about the boundaries of executive power versus the rule of law.
A fundamental debate. Okay, then shifting to the Supreme Court. They also made a significant move related to elections.
Yeah, they agreed to hear a specific case out of Mississippi. This case challenged the practice of counting mail-in ballots that arrive after Election Day, even if they were clearly postmarked on or before Election Day.
Okay, let's unpack the stakes there, because that sounds technical, but the impact could be huge. How common is that practice?
It's very common. About half of all U.S. states currently allow this kind of grace period for mail-in ballots. It's designed specifically to account for things like postal service delays, which are, inevitable.
Right. So if the court rules against that practice,
it would force dozens of states to scramble and change their election laws very quickly. Election officials warned it could disenfranchise potentially hundreds of thousands of voters whose ballots get delayed through no fault of their own, especially in rural areas or during really high turnout elections when the postal system is stressed.
So this case has the potential to really reshape how the upcoming 2026 midterm elections are run. Massive uncertainty for state election boards.
Huge uncertainty. Then, still with the court, a decision related to establish civil rights. They decided not to take up an appeal from Kim Davis.
The former Kentucky County Clerk. Remind us of that situation.
Right. She became known after refusing to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples back in 2015, right after the Supreme Court's Obergefell decision legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. She cited religious objections and ended up facing civil lawsuits.
So by declining her appeal, what signal did the court send?
Essentially, they maintained the legal status quo on marriage equality. The Obergefell ruling stands.
Advocacy groups saw that as significant.
Yes, as a reaffirmation that the core right established in Obergefell is settled law. Court watchers interpret it as signaling that, while there might be ongoing legal battles around the edges, particularly concerning religious liberty claims, the current court doesn't seem eager to revisit the fundamental right to same-sex marriage itself.
Okay. One more major legal development from that day, and this one had incredibly high stakes for vulnerable families, the situation with SNAP benefits.
Yeah, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps. This was a really confusing back and forth.
What happened?
So a federal appeals court had actually ruled against the administration, saying they had to pay out the full SNAP benefits for November, despite attempts to cut spending during the shutdown.
Okay, so that sounds like a win for benefit recipients.
It was initially, but then Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson issued a temporary pause on that lower court's ruling.
A pause. What does that mean practically?
It's called an administrative stay.
Yeah.
It basically freezes the lower court's order temporarily, giving the administration time to file its formal appeal to the full Supreme Court. But the immediate effect was injecting massive uncertainty back into the system.
Millions of families suddenly unsure if they'd get their full benefits.
Exactly. Anti-hunger groups were immediately alarmed, warning that any delay or cut, especially right before the holidays, would be devastating. On the other side, you had the argument for, quote, necessary budget control from conservatives who wanted to rein in spending during the fiscal crisis.
It just shows how these high-level legal maneuvers have immediate real-world consequences for people, especially during times of government instability.
Okay, so that covers the intense domestic political and legal scene. Now let's look at how the markets reacted. Because the news that the U.S. government wasn't going to default, at least not immediately, had a huge impact.
Right. How did the financial world respond to this temporary fix in Washington? #, no the global relief rally.
The reaction was pretty explosive and global. Leading up to November 10th, investors were clearly spooked. You had two big worries colliding. Ongoing volatility in the AI tech sector, which had seen some wild swings, and the paralysis in D.C.
And that data blackout we mentioned was key.
Absolutely key. No reliable U.S. economic data meant sophisticated investors, hedge funds, big banks. They were flying blind, relying on patchy or alternative data. It just gummed up the works for macro analysis.
So the moment that Senate deal looked like it was actually happening,
the pressure just released instantly. We saw this massive global relief rally, and it wasn't just a small bump. London's FTSE 100 index actually closed at a record high that day.
A record high in London because of a budget deal in Washington.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates how interconnected everything is. Why did the FTSE hit a record? Because the deal immediately reduced the risk, even if temporarily, of a U.S. default or a sharp U.S. recession. Either of those would have crushed global risk appetite, probably strengthened the dollar in a panic flight to safety initially, then destabilize currencies, mess with commodity prices, especially oil, which is priced in dollars.
So the whole world basically breathed a sigh of relief because the U.S., the bedrock of the global financial system, looked stable again, at least for a little while.
Precisely. And strategists pointed out it wasn't just the relief from avoiding disaster, it was also the reopening of the data spigot, as they called it.
Getting reliable numbers again.
Right. Suddenly you could expect inflation reports, job numbers, manufacturing data to start flowing again. That allows investors to shift from just reacting in panic mode back towards making decisions based on actual economic fundamentals. #TagB AI Bill Weathers lead.
Within that broader market rally, you mentioned the AI sector specifically stood out.
It really did. There had been a pretty sharp sell-off in AI-related stocks earlier in the week, driven by that volatility concern. But on November 10th, they snapped back hard, especially the big names, the bellwethers like NVIDIA and Palantir.
What does that specific rebound tell us? It seems like investors see the AI trend as almost unstoppable, even with political chaos.
That's exactly the read. The surge seemed to reflect two things happening at once. First, the general market belief, the risk-on sentiment coming back. But second, this persistent, almost unwavering belief in the long-term spending boom around AI infrastructure.
Companies like NVIDIA making the chips, Palantir with the data software seen as essential.
Seen as almost like the picks and shovels of the next gold rush. Indispensable infrastructure for whatever the next economic cycle looks like, driven by AI.
But analysts were still sounding notes of caution, weren't they? The risks hadn't just vanished.
Definitely not. Enthusiasm is high, yes, but the analysts quoted in the sources were quick to flag that valuations for many of these AI darlings are still incredibly high. Very rich, historically speaking.
So vulnerable to shocks.
Very vulnerable. And the underlying volatility risks haven't gone away. You still have potential supply chain issues, bottlenecks in advanced chip packaging, limits on manufacturing capacity, the big foundries like TSMC. Those haven't been solved.
And what about the geopolitical angle? That tension, especially with China, still impacts this sector heavily.
That's the other major risk factor. The whole AI and semiconductor space is right in the crosshairs of U.S.-China strategic competition. U.S. export controls limiting the sale of the most advanced AI chips to China, those are still in place.
Driven by national security concerns.
Right. And those rules create huge uncertainty for the revenue forecasts of companies like NVIDIA. So while the rally on November 10th was strong, it felt more like a relief bounce than a sign that all the risks in the AI sector had suddenly evaporated. #tag see war. Breakthroughs and ambitions in deep tech.
Okay, let's step away from the stock market picker for a moment and look at the actual science and technology. Because November 10th also saw a really significant announcement, a potential leap forward in quantum computing.
Yeah, this was big news coming out of Stanford University. Researchers there announced they had successfully synthesized a new type of quantum crystal. It's called STO, which stands for strontium titanium oxide.
Okay, STO. And the key breakthrough relates to stability and temperature.
Exactly. Let's break down the challenge for you, the listener. We always hear quantum computers need to be kept incredibly cold, right? Temperatures close to absolute zero.
Why is that?
Because qubits, the basic units of quantum information, whether they're tiny superconducting circuits or trapped ions, are unbelievably sensitive. Any little vibration, any stray magnetic field, any heat, it can cause them to lose their delicate quantum state. It's called decoherence. So you need these massive, complex, incredibly expensive refrigeration systems to keep everything stable at temperatures colder than outer space.
So the big deal about this STO crystal is
It allows stable qubit operation at higher temperatures. Still very cold by human standards, but significantly warmer than the near absolute zero required before.
how does the crystal do that?
It has unique properties in its atomic structure and electron behavior. Essentially, it shields the qubits better, maintains a very orderly electronic state even when there's a bit more thermal energy, a bit more jiggling from heat. It allows for stability above that standard millikelvin range.
And the implications of that are huge.
Immense. This is seen as a major step towards making large-scale, practical quantum computers a reality. If you can operate at higher temperatures, you can simplify the cooling systems, which make the whole machine potentially smaller, cheaper, and maybe even faster to operate. It could seriously accelerate the timeline for when quantum computers can actually solve real-world problems that are impossible for classical computers today.
You can see the ripple effects immediately. Defense applications, breaking encryption, designing new materials, new drugs. It fuels investment, but also major policy debates about national security, who controls this tech, and building the workforce needed to use it.
Definitely. And speaking of tech ambitions and competition, we also saw the ongoing drama of the commercial space race play out. Blue Origin had another delay.
Jeff Bezos' company. This was for their big New Glenn rocket, right?
That's the one. They were attempting the second launch, this time carrying a NASA mission, the twin Escapade probes meant to study Mars's atmosphere. But they had to scrub the launch attempt on November 10th due to bad weather.
Push it back a couple of days to the 12th. Why is this particular launch so important for Blue Origin?
It's a really critical test for them. First, it tests the heavy lift capability of the New Glenn rocket itself. But maybe even more importantly, it tests their reusability system.
Trying to catch up with SpaceX.
Exactly. They're aiming to land the massive first-stage booster on an autonomous drone ship out at sea, just like SpaceX does with Falcon 9. Success isn't just about getting the NASA probes on their way. It's about proving their rocket is reliable, and crucially, that their reuse model works. and can bring down launch costs.
So a lot riding on that eventual launch. Failure would be a significant setback in that fierce competition for government and commercial launch contracts.
A very big deal for them. Okay, one more item in this tech and science bucket. A significant regulatory shift from the FDA related to women's health.
Right, they announced plans to remove the black box warnings from many forms of menopause hormone therapy.
This is a major change, really reflecting an evolution in scientific understanding over 2 decades. That black box warning, it's the FDA's most serious type of warning on a drug label, was put on hormone therapy drugs back in the early 2000s.
Following those big Women's Health Initiative studies, the WHI studies.
Precisely. The initial interpretations of the WHI data showed increased risks of things like heart attacks, strokes, and certain cancers, particularly in older women who started therapy long after menopause began. That led to widespread fear and a dramatic drop in hormone therapy use.
So what's changed? Why remove the warning now?
Well, years of further research and reanalysis of the WHI data, plus other studies, have provided a much more nuanced picture. The consensus now is that the risks are highly dependent on factors like woman's age when she starts therapy, how far she is past menopause, the specific type and dose of hormones used.
So the original warning was maybe too broad.
That's the conclusion. The FDA decided the blanket warning was overly alarming for many women, especially younger women starting therapy closer to menopause for symptom relief, like hot flashes. It often led to women suffering needlessly because both they and their doctors were scared off by the warning.
So women's health groups welcomed this.
Yes, generally hailed as a win for evidence-based medicine and patient choice. It allows for more personalized conversations about the real risks and benefits for each individual woman, aligning the drug labeling with current clinical guidelines. Though, of course, vigilance about individual risk factors still remains important.
Okay, so while the U.S. was dealing with its internal whiplash shutdown ending, markets rallying, legal battles heating up the geopolitical stage, particularly in the Middle East, was seeing some absolutely extraordinary moves, both diplomatic and military.
Yeah, it was incredibly volatile. Let's start in Gaza. The ceasefire that followed the 2023 conflict. Yeah, the whole phase plan for what comes next. It was holding, but just barely, by a thread.
What did that plan involve again? It was pretty complex.
Extremely complex. It called for setting up some kind of transitional governing body for Gaza, bringing in international stabilization force, disarming militant groups like Hamas, and then massive reconstruction efforts. But deep distrust was everywhere.
And one of the immediate sticking points, according to the sources, was detainees, border controls, but also a specific group of fighters.
Right, there was this very specific, very thorny problem. Somewhere between 150 and 200 Hamas fighters were apparently trapped in tunnels near the Rafah border crossing in the south. Their fate became this huge point of tension as Phase 1 of the ceasefire plan was ending.
So what happened on November 10th related to that?
U.S. envoy Jared Kushner flew in and met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. The sources say the focus of that meeting was squarely on this issue. What to do about those trapped militants, and what were the immediate next steps for governance in Gaza.
What were the options for dealing with those fighters? Sounds like a no-win situation.
Pretty much. Israel was reportedly very reluctant to just grant them safe passage out of Gaza, say to Qatar or Turkey, because they felt it would legitimize Hamas. But any attempt to go into the tunnels after them risked Hamas immediately tearing up the entire ceasefire agreement and potentially triggering a much wider conflict.
And how are other countries in the region reacting? Were they eager to jump in and help stabilize things?
Not really. The diplomatic reactions highlighted how tricky this was. Key Arab states like the United Arab Emirates were publicly saying they wouldn't commit troops to any kind of stabilization force in Gaza unless there was a really clear, strong UN mandate spelling out their role, guaranteeing their safety and authority. Nobody wanted to get bogged down in another unwinnable situation.
And amidst all this high-stakes maneuvering, there was also a really poignant human element reported.
Yes. The confirmation that the remains of an Israeli soldier who had been killed way back in the 2014 conflict had finally been returned. It apparently took weeks of very sensitive, indirect negotiations to make that happen. Just a stark reminder of the deep emotional wounds and the long history underlying the current tensions.
Okay, now shifting slightly north, but still in the region, possibly the most surprising diplomatic development of the day, the U.S. and Syria.
Yeah, analysts were calling this seismic, a real shock. For decades, the U.S. policy towards Syria under President Ahmad al-Sharaa had been one of almost complete isolation. punishing sanctions related to the civil war, human rights abuses, the whole 9 yards.
So the idea of the Syrian president visiting the White House was unthinkable, basically.
Completely unthinkable, which is why President al-Sharaa showing up in Washington on November 10th for a meeting with President Trump was just stunning, reported the first time a Syrian leader had been there in decades.
How did this happen, and what was the deal?
It seems to have come directly out of that regional shuttle diplomacy Kushner was doing. And it wasn't just the visit. Simultaneously, the U.S. announced it was suspending some key sanctions against Syria for 180 days.
Suspending sanctions. Which ones, and why?
Crucially, the sanctions being lifted were ones specifically hindering humanitarian aid and reconstruction efforts, things that made it hard for international aid groups to operate, banking restrictions. The stated goal was to facilitate relief getting to the Syrian people in certain devastated areas.
Again, a sharp split in reactions. Who supported this move and why?
Supporters framed it as pragmatic realism, hard-nosed statecraft. The arguments were that you needed to engage Damascus if you wanted to influence the dynamics in Gaza, maybe create a bit of a counterweight to Iranian influence in Syria and Lebanon, and also, very practically, try to manage the ongoing Syrian refugee crisis that was still putting huge pressure on Europe and neighboring countries like Turkey and Jordan. The idea was, like it or not, you have to talk to them to stabilize the region.
But the critics, they must have been furious.
Absolutely furious. They argued it was a betrayal of principles, that the U.S. was basically legitimizing a regime accused of massive war crimes without getting any concrete commitments in return on human rights, accountability, or even a roadmap to end the civil war.
And how did U.S. allies in the region, like Israel or Saudi Arabia, view this sudden shift?
With extreme caution, according to the reports, they were watching very closely, likely worried that this dramatic change in U.S. policy could upset the delicate strategic balance in the Levant and potentially undermine their own regional influence or security calculations.
Wow, okay, so incredible diplomatic shifts. But at the same time, actual military tensions were spiking elsewhere, the Israel-Lebanon border.
Yeah, that fragile border heated up again. Reports confirmed an Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon that killed 2 members of Hezbollah.
What prompted the strike?
Israel stated it was a response to increased militant activity they had observed coming from that area, citing things like drone incursions and specific intelligence about planned attacks across the border.
And Hezbollah's reaction?
They immediately vowed to retaliate. The Israeli military went on high alert along the northern border, mobilizing some reserve units. International groups, especially the UN peacekeeping force there, UNIFIL, were issuing urgent calls for restraint from both sides. Everyone knows how quickly things can escalate on that border. A miscalculation, a cycle of retaliation. It could easily spiral into a much bigger, devastating war. #tag Global Security and Conflict Updates. Okay, stepping outside the Middle East for a moment, other global security issues were also prominent on November 10th. The war in Ukraine, sadly, continued its grim trajectory.
More attacks on infrastructure.
Yes. Fresh reports of widespread power cuts across major Ukrainian cities. This followed another wave of Russian missile and drone strikes specifically targeting energy facilities, power plants, substations.
Just as winter is starting to bite, the humanitarian impact must be severe.
Exactly. It raises immediate fears about heating, keeping hospitals running, grid stability, plus the economic impact of industrial slowdowns. And while that was happening on the ground, officials in Brussels were grappling with how to keep Ukraine financially afloat.
The support packages, were they discussing new options?
They were discussing some politically very sensitive and legally quite tricky ideas. The main one being finding ways to use the frozen Russian state assets, billions held in European banks, to help fund Ukraine.
How would that work, actually confiscating the assets?
That's the debate, whether they could legally confiscate them outright or perhaps use the proceeds generated by those assets, or maybe even borrow against the value of the assets. Huge legal questions, but also a strong moral argument being made that Russia should, in effect, pay for the damage it's causing.
A complex issue. Okay, shifting continents now. There was a major security incident in India.
Yes, in Delhi. A deadly car explosion near the Red Fort metro station, a really historic and busy area. Reports said 8 people were killed, several others injured.
Do they know what caused it? Terrorism suspected.
Authorities immediately raised security levels across the capital region, detained some initial suspects, and launched a major counterterrorism probe. While they didn't confirm a specific group immediately, the location and nature of the attack definitely amplified fears about urban terrorism and challenged the city's preparedness.
A reminder of the vulnerability of large cities. Okay, lastly in this section, a development concerning the opioid crisis involving China.
Right. This was seen as a potentially positive, though maybe fragile, diplomatic step. China announced it was tightening controls on the export of certain chemicals.
Chemicals used to make illicit fentanyl.
Exactly. They announced new licensing requirements for exporting 13 specific precursor chemicals that are known ingredients used by drug cartels, primarily in Mexico, to synthesize fentanyl, which then floods into the U.S.
And this came after talks with the U.S.
Yes, it followed several rounds of discussions between U.S. and Chinese officials specifically on this issue. Anti-opioid campaigners in the U.S. cautiously welcomed it as a concrete step that could potentially disrupt the supply chain for illicit fentanyl production.
Cautiously welcomed. Skepticism remains.
Some skepticism, yes. Questions about how rigorously these new rules would actually be enforced, whether there are loopholes. But still, in the context of otherwise very strained U.S.-China relations, marked by competition over trade, tech, and Taiwan, this bit of cooperation on the fentanyl issue was seen as a small, positive sign. So we've covered politics, markets, conflicts. But underlying all of this, the sources from November 10th really hammer home that the biggest long-term challenge that changing global environment is continuing relentlessly, and it's manifesting both as policy debate and as immediate devastating disasters.
Right. And the main global focus for that policy debate kicked off on this day. COP30 opened in Brazil.
Yes, the big UN climate conference, COP30, began in Belém, Brazil. The location itself is symbolic, right there on the edge of the Amazon rainforest. Underscores the stakes immediately.
And the mood? Optimistic.
Not really. The sources suggest expectations were high, maybe desperately so, because the previous few years had seen a real struggle to turn the promises made at past COPs into actual rapid emissions cuts.
Who set the tone?
The UN's climate chief gave the opening address, and it was stark, really dire warnings, saying that failure to accelerate the shift away from fossil fuels wouldn't just mean more warming, it would lead directly to famine, widespread conflict over resources, and persistent global inflation driven by climate impacts.
Strong words. What was on the official agenda?
Delegates managed to agree on the agenda items. Brazil, as the host, was pushing hard for concrete action on deforestation, cutting methane emissions, and that ever-present issue, climate finance for developing countries.
But where are the big fights expected? Where is that great deferral strategy likely to play out again?
Two main areas, according to the sources. First, the exact wording around fossil fuels. It's always a battle. Will the final text call for a phase down or the much stronger phase out? Huge fight there.
And the second?
Money. Who pays for the transition to clean energy globally? And how do they actually make the loss and damage fund work? That's the fund meant to help vulnerable nations already suffering irreversible climate impacts. These are trillion-dollar questions, and often the toughest decisions get pushed to the next COP.
And connecting back to our earlier discussion, the start of COP30 was somewhat overshadowed by the U.S. situation, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Noticeably, due to the chaos around the shutdown ending and the budget deal, there's no formal high-level U.S. participation on the very first day of the conference. That absence immediately raised questions about global leadership on climate and the commitment level of the world's largest historical emitter, right at the start of crucial negotiations. #NEVB, extreme weather and displacement.
And the urgency of those talks in Belém was tragically highlighted by extreme weather events happening elsewhere on that same day. The Philippines took another hit.
A brutal hit. They were struck by Super Typhoon Fung-wong. Its local name was Uwan. And this came right after they were already reeling from another storm, Typhoon Kelmaigi.
How bad was Fung-wong?
Really bad. The reports from November 10th indicated at least 8 deaths already, and over 1.4 million people displaced across several provinces in northern Luzon. We're talking catastrophic flooding, huge storm surges along the coast, landslides.
Infrastructure must have been devastated.
Widespread power outages across vast areas, which severely hampered the initial rescue and relief efforts. And climate scientists were immediately pointing out the link. Warmer ocean waters are providing more fuel for these storms, allowing them to intensify much more rapidly, like Fung-wong did. Makes it harder to prepare and evacuate.
A clear example of the climate impacts happening now. Meanwhile, a very different kind of extreme weather was hitting the U.S.
Yeah, the Midwest got slammed by a massive and very early snowstorm.
Where exactly?
Blanketed major cities like Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis with several inches of heavy, wet snow. This caused huge travel disruptions. Airports snarled, roads treacherous, thousands of flight cancellations piling on top of the shutdown-related ones, plus power outages and economic losses as businesses closed. Transport slowed down.
And scientists connect this to climate change, too, even though it's snow.
Yes, it's cited as evidence of climate variability. Not just overall warming, but more extreme, erratic, and unpredictable weather patterns. More intense storms, whether they bring rain or snow, happening outside of their usual seasons. It fuels that debate about needing more resilient infrastructure and better climate preparedness.
And all these events, the storms, the droughts we know happening elsewhere, combined with conflicts, they're driving displacement, right?
Massively. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, released a report around this time, and the sources mention it documented record numbers of displaced people globally in 2025.
What were the main drivers?
The report pointed to the ongoing wars in Ukraine, the Middle East situation we discussed, but it specifically highlighted the increasing role of unprecedented weather-related disasters, mentioning massive droughts in Africa, intense flooding in parts of Asia.
And the world isn't keeping up.
The report stressed that the international system's capacity to respond is completely overwhelmed. There just isn't enough aid, enough resources, enough political will to handle crises on this scale. And that inevitably fuels those really difficult, politically explosive debates about migration policies in wealthier countries in Europe and North America. #TagC, infrastructure stress check.
One more event that fits this theme of systems under stress, a serious accident in Europe.
Yes, in Slovakia. A bad train collision near a town called Pezinok.
What happened?
An express train ran into the back of a stationary passenger train. The impact was severe. 79 people were injured, with 13 needing hospitalization.
Do they know the cause?
Early indications pointed towards human error. But the incident immediately sparked a broader public debate in Slovakia and neighboring countries about the state of the railways. Questions about the adequacy of the signaling systems, the effectiveness of crew training procedures, and crucially, the chronic underinvestment in railway infrastructure across much of Central Europe. How long can these systems keep running safely if maintenance keeps getting deferred and upgrades don't happen?
Another example of the potential cost when long-term investment is put off. Deferral again.
Okay, so we've hit the politics, the economy, the global flashpoints, the climate impacts. But there was one more major rupture happening on November 10th, and this one strikes at the heart of trust in information itself. A crisis at the BBC.
Right. One of the world's most recognized and usually respected news organizations facing a major internal meltdown. What was the trigger?
It stemmed from a huge controversy over a specific documentary program, Panorama. The program included an excerpt of former President Trump's remarks from January 6th, but it was apparently edited in a way that critics, especially conservatives, immediately jumped on as misleading and biased.
An editorial judgment that backfired spectacularly.
Massively. The sources describe it as a full-blown crisis of governance and credibility for the BBC. The fallout was incredibly swift and severe.
Leadership had to go.
By November 10th, yes. Both the Director General, Tim Davie, and the CEO of BBC News, Deborah Turness, had resigned over the handling of the controversy. The BBC chair had issued a public apology, calling it a serious error of judgment and acknowledging the damage to trust.
This feels like more than just one bad editing decision, though. What are the bigger implications?
Absolutely. Media analysts were saying this crisis would likely force a major overhaul of the BBC's internal compliance processes, its editorial standards, how things get signed off. But perhaps more significantly, it poured gasoline on the fire of external pressure.
Pressure to reform the BBC itself.
Exactly. Calls to fundamentally reform its governance structure, and especially its funding model, the license fee, which is always controversial and was coming up for renewal. This crisis gave ammunition to critics who argued the BBC is inherently biased or can't be impartial.
So it taps into those huge fundamental questions about the media today.
Precisely. What is the role of a state-funded public broadcaster in today's incredibly polarized political environment? How can an institution like the BBC maintain impartiality, which is its core promise, when it's under such intense attack from all sides? The BBC crisis really felt like a microcosm of the challenge facing all established institutions trying to maintain public trust in this chaotic information age. #outrag_outro.
So as we try to pull all these threads together from November 10th, 2025, these global rallies, the local crises, the scientific leaps, this distinct pattern of governance really does emerge, doesn't it?
It really does. We saw these incredible reversals packed into one day, the U.S. shutdown suddenly ending, that unexpected diplomatic opening with Syria, the big jump forward in quantum computing.
And the thing that screams out from all the sources is just how tightly interconnected everything is now. You can't isolate these events.
No way. A budget failure in Washington sends the London stock market to a record high. Political maneuvering over militants trapped in Gaza happens against the backdrop of accelerating climate migration documented by the UN. The political, the financial, the environmental, the scientific, they're all tangled together.
We definitely saw examples of resilience, too. The markets bouncing back immediately, aid agencies mobilizing for Typhoon Fung-wong.
True, there's a capacity to react, but looking at the bigger picture, the overwhelming strategy revealed in these sources for tackling the really hard problems seems to be what we call the Great Deferral.
Yeah, just kicking the can down the road seems to be the default playbook almost everywhere.
The U.S. budget fight, pushed into January 2026. The really tough decisions on phasing out fossil fuels at COP30, deferred for more bargaining later. The ultimate fate of militants or long-term governance in Gaza, handled through temporary phases while the hard solution gets punted.
So, the final thought for you, the listener, watching all this unfold, what does this reliance on constant deferral actually mean?
The global system might be resilient enough to absorb a temporary shock, like a government shutdown or a diplomatic crisis. But is it resilient enough to withstand a permanent political strategy of just delaying the inevitable?
If the biggest, most fundamental challenges, climate change, deep political divisions, systemic inequalities are constantly put off, how stable is the whole structure when the next really big, truly unavoidable crisis finally hits, the one that can't be deferred?
That feels like the central question facing governance in the late 2020s, something to definitely think about until our next deep dive.